So I think that efficient causation is the only causation there is, and that Spinoza got it right in the 17th century to reject final causes as fictions that are just projected by the human mind. But I'm not here to talk about metaphysics. I'm here to talk about the ethics of end-of-life decisions. So I work for the federal government, so I need to let you know that these are my own views. Once you hear the views, that would be pretty obvious. So I'm going to try to outline what I call a revisionary conception of medical ethics relating to end-of-life decisions. I'm going to say to justify killing or to bring the temperature down, causing death is a routine but unacknowledged practice in medicine. We find it in withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and also vital organ donation. I'm not going to have time today to talk about the organ donation question. I'm going to argue that there isn't any moral bright line between withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death. And I'm going to respond to the critique of the ethics of sovereign decision that Farr laid out here. So I'm putting up this slide not only to give a plug for my book, but I don't have much time now, so I'm going to have to only give you the bare bones of the argument. I'm going to have to be somewhat dogmatic, and the arguments are laid out much more systematically here. This isn't a financial conflict of interest because as a government employee, I get no royalties. So, as we all know, there are traditional norms that prohibit killing in medicine. There's the Hippocratic Oath. There's this a statement by four distinguished physician ethicists in the late 1980s in response to an anonymous narrative published in JAMA called "It's All Over, Debbie." So the conventional view is that withdrawing life-sustaining treatment allows the patient to die but does not cause death, and the cause of death is the underlying medical condition. Is this credible? And I think the answer is no. So I want to present a real case, the case of Debbie, a woman age 50 who was thrown from her horse in a horse show event and sustained a high-level spinal cord injury. She became quadriplegic, vent-dependent, and 2 years after the accident, she decided that her life was no longer worth living. I'm giving you a very telescopic view of a complicated case here. And she was admitted to the ICU of an academic medical center for the purpose of stopping her ventilator with prior sedation. So what caused Debbie's death? Was it the spinal cord injury? Now, Debbie clearly could have lived for many years with continued mechanical ventilation and personal care. And so I see withdrawing life-sustaining treatment as setting in motion the causal chain which led to death from the inability to breathe caused by spinal cord injury. It's true if you put us on, healthy people on a ventilator and stop it, it's not going to cause death. But in patients who are not able to breathe spontaneously and can live for long periods of time with mechanical ventilation, withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is a cause of death of the patient. And I think this is based on our common sense understanding of causation. When we're inquiring why a person died, we're seeking to understand why she died at a given time. And without the withdrawal, patients on life-sustaining treatment would continue to live for more or less time. Sometimes only a short period of time, but other times it could be years. So that also I think that the power of withdrawing a ventilator to cause death is really the flip side of the power of mechanical ventilation to preserve life. In other words, it would not have the ability to preserve life if stopping mechanical ventilation were not a cause of death. So consider two contrasting cases. These are two patients in the ICU on ventilators with the same medical condition. I want to stress the same condition. So patient A, a family member decides to stop treatment based on the patient's prior preferences and values. Patient B, with the same condition, family member decides to continue treatment on these same grounds. Is it coherent to hold that the underlying condition causes death, not the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. A dies, B lives. They have the same condition. So the underlying condition itself cannot be the cause of death. Is there a moral bright line between withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death, either by prescription or administration of lethal medication? And what I mean by that is that in traditional medical ethics, the idea is that withdrawing life-sustaining treatment is often morally justified, but physician-assisted death is never justified. So now consider a contrasting case of Steve. This is a hypothetical case. So Steve got a severe spinal cord injury in a bicycle accident. 2 years later, he remains quadriplegic, but he's not ventilator dependent. Steve wishes to die. He has no life-sustaining treatment which he can withdraw. Therefore, he requests his physician to administer a lethal injection. If withdrawing life-sustaining treatment for Debbie is morally justified to relieve suffering and respect her autonomy, why not the same for a lethal injection in the case of Steve? Now, one difference you might say here is intentions. So I think we need to look at the intentions of the patient and the intentions of the clinician. Debbie, without question, intended to die by withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, and Steve intended to die as well. So as far as the patients go, there isn't any difference in intention in these two cases. Now, what did the clinicians intend who agreed to stop the ventilator? Well, I think intentions in end-of-life scenarios are often murky and ambiguous. However, in the philosopher's brief, which was a brief written by 5 very distinguished philosophers in connection with the Supreme Court's decision in 1997 to review assisted suicide cases, these philosophers contended whether a doctor turns off a respirator in accordance with the patient's request or prescribes pills that a patient may take when he is ready to kill himself, the doctor acts with the same intention to help the patient die. I think it's reasonable to say that in Debbie's case that the clinicians were intending to help Debbie die, to achieve her preferences by stopping the life-sustaining treatment. Turning to justification, both withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death are justified by the same underlying moral values, the responsibility of doctors to relieve suffering, and respect patient determination. The patient has waived the right not to be killed by either refusing treatment or by requesting a lethal injection. And I'm going to argue, although I don't have time to go in the details, that both withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death are consistent with the professional integrity of clinicians. So in the mid-1990s, an international panel of experts was convened by the Hastings Center to develop a conception of the goals of medicine. They came up with the 4 goals listed here, and I think that physician-assisted death is clearly consistent with the second goal, to relieve suffering, and the 4th goal, to pursue a peaceful death. I have also argued that physician-assisted death is consistent with the legitimate moral constraints that we put on physicians in pursuing these goals, but I don't have time to go into that argument. Let's turn now to this concept of sovereign decision. So Jeff argues that those who reject a moral bright line between withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death have adopted an ethics of sovereign decision. Sovereign decision, he writes, is the prior cause in both refusing technology and in suicide. Death is the final effect in both refusing technology and in suicide. The doctor compelled to assist the sovereign patient cannot claim a conscientious objection because final causes are barred from her thinking or doing. So I think we properly think of end-of-life decisions within a context of shared decision-making which involves negotiation between the patient and the clinician. And so respecting the right to refuse treatment doesn't mean that the doctor should immediately comply with the demands of competent patients. There's a general consensus that after spinal cord injury, patients should wait a reasonable length of time. Some people write 2 years. There's no evidence base for this, but the general idea seems quite sound. Patients should wait a certain length of time before activating a decision to die by stopping life-sustaining treatment, to undergo the rehabilitation process and adjust to a new life after a traumatic injury. So there are very good reasons for clinicians to try to persuade a patient to hold off stopping life-sustaining treatment, to negotiate in light of the patient's preferences and values. I'll speed up along here. Now, often it's thought that when people say there's no bright line between withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and physician-assisted death, it means that there are no morally significant differences between those two practices. That's not true. There's a right to refuse treatment. It's ultimately up to the competent patient, but there's no right to lethal medication. And if physician-assisted death were to be legalized, doctors should be free to refuse requests, and in the Netherlands, where the practice is legal and lethal, physicians frequently refuse requests. It's very common. Physician-assisted death, in my view, should be an option of last resort for intolerable suffering related to terminal or irreversible conditions, and the ethics of physician-assisted death is not a matter of the sovereign decision of the patient. It's something that certainly needs to be negotiated, and clinicians need to agree that prescription or administration of lethal medication is a reasonable option, all things considered. So, after reading Jeff's book, I found myself really actually rather puzzled where he stands on the ethics of end-of-life decisions. Does the competent patient have a right to refuse life-sustaining treatment? Is it acceptable for legally authorized surrogates to refuse life-sustaining treatment for patients in a persistent vegetative state? So in conclusion, we need to abandon the norm that doctors must not kill as an absolute prohibition. It's not coherent with the justified practices of withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and also vital organ donation, although I didn't talk about that today. Physician-assisted death can be morally justified as a practice of last resort to relieve suffering and respect autonomy, and physician-assisted death with appropriate constraints is consistent with the professional integrity of physicians. Thank you very much.